Now this brisket, there's two ways to do it. Well, there's all kinds of ways to smoke it, but there's two basic trays of thoughts. We can do low and slow, which means we smoke this brisket somewhere between 10 and 14, 16, 24 hours, depending on how slow you want to go with it. Or high heat cook would be, we're smoking it between 325 and 375 for about 5 hours. And with that process, we would, halfway between, we'd wrap the meat and in aluminum foil and continue the smoke. But this one, we are going to smoke it low and slow, but we're going to focus on trimming it today. Trimming and rubbing. So what I'll do is I'm going to start with the meat side. And I've got this big cap I want to deal with, and I also got this thin layer of fat that's on here. So what I do with the thin layer is I just trim it off and put my fat. And how I do it, you know, I can just go along and trim it that way with the fat. There we go, just like that. If I get a good piece though that has layer, what I'll do is I'll work my knife underneath the fat so that it's in between the fat and the meat, and then I'll just run my blade all the way through, and then I cut mostly fat and hardly any meat. You can see that? So that makes quick work of it. Just kind of delicately run my knife underneath the meat, kind of using a sawing motion back and forth, and slide the blade underneath the fat. I don't want to cut too much of the meat layer, I just want to get the fat. I want to try to get all this fat. And the reason why I'm taking all the fat off of this side is because I want my rub to adhere directly to the meat and create a bark. And if there's fat here, that fat will render off, and that area where the fat renders, the bark won't stick to the meat. And so that's why I'm basically trimming this down bare as I can, so that my bark created by the rub will stay on the meat. So I get another piece right here. It's nice. Trim that. Okay. Here we go. And while I'm doing this, I'm paying attention to the direction of the grain of the meat, because I'm going to identify this cut of meat with a knife mark, so that later on when the crust is on there, I'll know what direction the grain is going, because I want to carve this brisket when it's done cooking against the grain. So in the opposite direction of the grain, that's how I'm going to carve this piece of meat. And so it'll be much easier for me to tell the direction that the grain is going when the meat doesn't have rub on it that's created a bark. So because of that, I'm going to go ahead and I mark it in such a way that I can tell later which way I need to carve. And so the grain of the meat is going this way. That's the grain of the meat like this. And so I'm going to just go ahead and cut a notch in this meat just like that. And so that lets me know later on that when I get ready to carve this, I want to carve it this way. Okay? So that takes care of the front half. Now I'm going to work on this big thick piece of fat.
Dad, how long does it usually take you to carve?
So my daughter asked me how long does it usually take to carve a brisket. And it really just depends on how much of a fat layer that I have on the brisket. Sometimes you get a brisket and it's got very little fat layer on it, and it doesn't take very much very long at all. And other times you get one that's got a lot of fat and it takes you a while to do the job right. Well, you just take your time. And another thing that you always want to remember is when you're using a very sharp knife, or any knife really, you want to cut away from your holding hand, not into it. So I cut off that big rim of fat there. I also have a piece of an edge here that's kind of white in color. Let me show you that. And that's where they did their ammonia wash when it was processing this meat. And I don't really want any of that either, so I'm just going to go ahead and trim that edge so that is no longer on the meat. I don't want to trim too much of the edge because I like brisket. I don't want to give too much of it to the dog, so my dog really likes me when I start to carve up a brisket. What we do is we boil up the trimmings there and we mix that in with the regular dog food, and they're really happy, aren't they? I got a piece here, that ammonia wash.
That's a nice piece.
Okay, now I'm going to start to work on the meat itself, and this big layer of fat sitting right here. There we go. It's important that you get yourself a really sharp knife when you're doing this. And if it's not sharp, you use a sharpener. Now, I like to use a fillet knife like this one here because it's got that thin point, and when I'm sliding it underneath the fat on the other side, on this side, it does a good job of doing that. So I don't have much fat layer dividing the decal from the flat, which is means I just don't need to cut away as much on this side. I don't want to get too crazy with cutting because one of the things that I can do later is just slide my knife. Once this meat is cooked, I'll be able to just slide my knife through it and all of that fat will just slide right off. And then really I want to try to use this fat for rendering through the meat, and that's what keeps the meat moist. You've probably tasted dry brisket before, and most of the times the meat is dry because there wasn't enough fat left in the meat to keep it moist. And the cooking process obviously has a lot to do with that too. Alright, I think I'm just about done. When I first started cooking briskets, I got a little carried away on carving up the brisket and the fat. If I see a big vein, I'll cut that out too, or a gland or a blemish, I'll cut that out too, because that won't render. So, there we go. Pretty good. I'm just sliding my knife. I'm really not cutting anything out. I'm just pre-cutting my decal off. I'm going to slide my knife through there because I'm going to want to season that up too underneath there. And I'll get my rub all the way through that to flavor that side of the meat. So I'm pretty much done on this side. I'll turn this over, and over here on this side, it's fairly thin as it is. So I'm going to leave this section uncarved. I've just got a thick cap right here. I'm going to trim a little bit there and trim a little bit here. So I'm going to take my blade and just come along, making sure I don't cut too deep. Just going to trim the edge of this off. There we go. Making sure that I don't cut too deep. So, can you tell the people whether or not you like barbecue?
Well, I like barbecue, but you kind of get sick after all the tastings.
When we do the competitions, we do it as a family. There's 4 of us, 2 girls, my wife, and me. We compete as a family. We do everything in the cook-off together, and you know, it's a family affair for me. I really enjoy it. The tour is great, and we have a lot of fun with it. So here we go. We've got a trimmed up brisket. Yeah, I could probably go along this edge a little bit more and try to get this piece, but you know, this isn't an exact science. It's an art, and as you go along and you trim up a couple of hundred briskets, you get better at it, and you know, you just go until you feel like you're done. And I feel like I'm done. So I've got my brisket here prepped. It's pretty good. Next step is going to be putting on some rub, and then after I rub it, I could choose to inject it with a special injection sauce that I like to use on the competition. And I kind of do it differently than maybe some other people. I'll go ahead and rub this brisket down, then I'll wrap it with saran wrap, and then I'll inject it through the saran wrap. And the reason why I do that is because I want the injection to stay in the meat and not get squirted halfway from here to Kingdom Come. And sometimes that happens. You'll be poking a piece of meat and you'll be squeezing injection in it, and there's a stream of injections going this way. So about a month ago, I just said to myself, you know what, there's a better way to do this. So I started wrapping my meat and then injecting, and that seems to be working for me.